We're going to continue to review ancient Egypt. We're going to continue where we left off for our English class, and we're going to continue to talk about the Nile River and then talk about the river people around the Nile as well. So let's talk about settling the Nile. So, in addition to the two deserts that we talked about earlier, the Nile also had the Mediterranean Sea to the north and the Red Sea to the east. Now, having these seas and access to one another, having access to both of these seas would allow a lot of trade with other people. So they could travel along the sea in order to trade with other people that they wanted to trade with. And also, they were able to trade within Egypt because the Nile River went all along Egypt. So they could travel with other peoples through these seas, and they could travel along the Nile River to communicate with the rest of Egypt and trade with the rest of Egypt. So there are even more reasons why the location of Egypt was just so important and so helpful. So the river people. So the river people were the people that lived along the Nile River. The Nile River. So the Nile River had a lot of flooding, but the floods were predictable and were not necessarily devastating. They are not quite as destructive as the flooding around the Mesopotamian was. Each spring, there would be flooding, but it would leave a dark, fertile mud along its banks. And this fertile mud would allow people to plant crops and any sort of thing that they needed for food, or more than just food, other products as well. But they were able to plant crops in this fertile mud that would be left behind along the Nile River after the flood waters would go back. And these farmers ended up learning about the waters of the Nile, and they used this soil left behind by the floods to grow wheat, barley, and flax seeds, all sorts of stuff that was very helpful for them at the time. So these farmers eventually they start learning about irrigation. So irrigation revolves around planting and crops. So they dug these basins to trap floodwaters. They dug canals to channel water to the fields and built dikes to strengthen the basin walls. Essentially, they did a lot of stuff with the Nile River in order to make the Nile River help them even more in regards to their crops. The Nile already provided a fertile area of mud, but now they can channel waters to fields, they can trap floodwaters to keep them from getting too bad, and strengthen the walls around it. So all of these things to help their safety and in order to make it easier for them to grow crops. Now, a really important thing from this period of time is papyrus. Now, papyrus was a reed plant that grew along the Nile, and it was used to make baskets, sandals, and river rafts, and it was later even used to make paper. So this is a picture of what papyrus looks like right here. Very, very useful for many different items, baskets, sandals, and river rafts. And when before I said not just food, this is another thing that I was talking about in regards to crops. So it actually grew along the Nile, though, rather than just being put there. This papyrus actually grew along the Nile, and it helped in many, many different ways. And as you can see from here, when it's dried up, papyrus does have a very interesting texture that can be used for all sorts of things. You may be able to see now where they're able to use it for baskets and paper. And let's talk about hieroglyphics here. So hieroglyphics were the Egyptian system of writing, and this Egyptian system of writing consisted of thousands of picture symbols, and it may seem like a very interesting and strange sort of way to write given the way that we write nowadays, but it was pretty helpful for them back then. Many different picture symbols, and men learned to read and write, and they attended schools to learn to be scribes. So why might scribes be important to Egyptian civilization? Because rulers and other people in power, like priests and priestesses, needed scribes for record keeping. Without having a written language, guys, you don't have any records. And when you're in power, you're going to want to have records of what is happening and why. So these scribes were very, very helpful in this regard. They were there to take note of everything that is happening in their kingdom, and they were very helpful. A few people could go to school to be scribes. So there are not many people the rulers could hire to work as scribes, which made them incredibly important. And here is an old illustration of scribes. All right, guys, well, thank you. Please look at your instructions